Does the text of Psalm 72, verse 11, tell us how to know the one true King?
That's an excellent question. That verse has given rise to varied interpretations. Psalm 72, verse 11 has traditionally been read within two broad interpretive streams. Jewish exegesis commonly understands the verse as a royal prayer for Solomon or the Davidic dynasty, envisioning an ideal political horizon in which foreign kings bow and nations serve Israel's anointed ruler. The verse is seen as a poetic aspiration, a vision of stability, justice, and global recognition of God's appointed king. Christian commentary, inheriting this framework, often extends the referent beyond historical monarchy to a future messianic fulfillment. Here, the verse becomes eschatological. The king before whom all monarchs bow is not merely David's descendant, but the anointed Redeemer to come. In both traditions, the surface grammar is straightforward. The king is elevated, the nations submit, and history culminates in universal homage. But confining our analysis to the original text itself presents an interesting challenge. I will use the original Hebrew prior to the addition of Masoretic vowels. The Hebrew is not merely declarative, it is architectural. When the text is examined at the consonantal level rather than the lexical level, patterns emerge that are not visible in translation. The verse does not only say that kings bow and nations serve, it depicts how sovereignty arises, how authority cascades into the world, and how humanity enters into ordered relationship with rule. Instead of a static messianic scene, we discover a dynamic process. Kingship generated, enthronement sealed, dominion extended, rulers aligned, nations awakened, and service enacted. The verse is not a statement, it is a diagram. As in classical rabbinic methods, we proceed not merely by translation or paraphrase, but by engaging the sequence of consonantal characters directly, extracting their conceptual implications. The analytic method we employ, triadic letter grouping, allows the coded architecture to surface. The sequential triplets uncover conceptual units embedded within the text, each describing a stage or function of monarchy. These segments, when recombined into higher triads, reveal an ascending structural system: the emergence of kingship, the organization of worldly authority, the awakening and service of the nations, the coherence of the whole kingdom, and finally, the indwelling revelation that completes the system. Where traditional exegesis sees bowing, our method sees formation. Traditional exegesis sees service, our method sees divine habitation. By approaching the consonants as generators of meaning rather than phonetic residues, we allow the text to speak in the language of its own architecture. This approach does not overturn historical interpretation, it deepens it. Where traditional readings describe what will happen, structural analysis reveals how and why it happens. Where theology identifies Messiah as king, our triadic reading unveils the metaphysical mechanics of kingship itself. What emerges is not merely a prophecy of world submission, but a map of the process by which God indwells creation through royal order. In this way, Psalm 72, verse 11 becomes more than a verse. It becomes a schema of sovereignty, perception, and union. I will continue phrase by phrase. In the New International Version, Psalm 72 verse 11 begins, "May all kings." The structural analysis of Psalm 72:11 begins at its foundation, not with a theological abstraction, but with the actual form of the text. Here, we consider the first 9 letters of the verse, grouped into 3 syntactic triads, and observe how they unfold a generative pattern. Each segment consists of 3 consonants that, taken together, offer a conceptual formation, not a mere word, but a structural dynamic. We then consider how seeing the concepts in a triad helps define and explain the verse. The first segment gives rise to the sovereign. The second sets him into structure. The third describes the movement of rule through space, the king, the throne, and dominion. These are not separate episodes, but successive crystallizations of a single emergent order. So we begin not with a throne, not with a kingdom, not even with a crown, but with the king himself. And yet, he does not emerge already enthroned. He is not a product of coronation or heredity. He is generated, not appointed. His being is the convergence of three principles represented by the first three characters of the verse: Vav, Yod, and Shin, a human frame, a divine spark, and a flame of ruling power. Vav, the nail or hook, represents the one who connects. In this position, it does not symbolize just any man, but man as axis, the being that joins heaven and earth. Yod is the point of divine contraction, the smallest and most potent form of energy. It signifies concentrated essence, the undiluted spark of origin that chooses embodiment. Shin is the fire, not the fire of destruction, but of rulership, judgment, and manifest force. It is the dynamic, three-pronged flame that both reveals and governs. Together, these three generate the king, not a man elevated, but a condition produced, when the divine contracts into the human and ignites into authority. This king does not take the throne. He radiates kingship simply by being what he is. The fusion of Yod and Shin within Vav transforms the man into monarch. He stands not as ruler over the earth, but as an emanation of order into it. But kingship as essence is not yet kingship as structure. From the king, the second triad brings forth the throne. Not a chair, not a symbol. The throne is the form into which the king is set, the matrix that receives his identity and defines it. Its structure is built from Tav, Chet, and Vav, seal, boundary, and bond. Tav marks the completion of a process. It seals legitimacy, indicating not just right, but fulfillment. Chet establishes distinction. It carves out a sacred enclosure, separating what is royal from what is profane. And Vav again binds, this time not the heavens and the man, but the man to the office. Together, these produce enthronement, not as ceremony, but as metaphysical crystallization. The king is now enclosed in rule. He is no longer merely an emanation of divine force. He is consecrated into structure. From this form, the third triad draws forth dominion. Dominion is not power imposed. It is the radiance of enthronement made spatial. It emerges from Vav, Lamed, and Vav, continuity, instruction, and return. Lamd, the staff or goad, is the axis of direction, authority expressed as guidance. It stands between two Vavs, which serve as lines of transmission, one extending outward, the other returning inward. This is not linear conquest, but patterned rule. Dominion here is reciprocal. Law issues from the center, reaches the edges, and returns to the throne. It forms an orbit of coherence, not a campaign of dominance. These three triads, king, throne, dominion, form the first great movement of the verse. They describe not monarchy as a political condition, but kingship as a cosmological event. A king is generated through the descent of divine fire into human form. That king is sealed into identity by enthronement, and from that enthronement arises a field of ordered rule. Authority is not seized, it unfolds. Rule is not enforced, it emanates. Dominion is the breath of sovereignty made visible, structured, and shared. This is not the beginning of a reign. It is the beginning of a world. So now we continue with the text of Psalm 72 verse 11. In the New International Version, this reads, "Bow down to him." Beneath the emergence of the sovereign, the singular king enthroned at the center of order, another layer of rule begins to unfold. It is not divine in origin, but it is ordered by it. This stratum belongs to the kings of the earth, numerous, differentiated, human. Their crowns are not original, but derivative, casting the light they receive. They form the second motion of the verse, the stratification of the world under kingship. Here, authority becomes plural. From emanated sovereignty above arises political structure below. We divide these next 9 letters into 3 segments. The first segment of this triad gives us 3 consonants, kaf, lamed, and mem, the palm, the goad, and the waters. This is the vision of all kings as a collective body. Kaf is the curved hand, the vessel of power held but not generated. It is a symbol of contained authority, strength exercised but received. Lamed stands next as the teaching staff, the implement of guidance and elevation, the idea of rank, ascent, and hierarchy. And mem, the flowing water, represents the multitudes, peoples, nations, the masses from which rulers rise and toward which they direct their rule. These 3 together do not describe any one king, but rather the global field of rulership, distributed, hierarchical, and secondary. These are the kings of the earth, who rule as a reflection of higher authority, not its source. Their crowns are permissions, their thrones, echoes. They do not possess what they wield. They are conduits, rivers branching outward from a higher mountain, each carrying a thread of the royal current into the world. But kingship is not merely structural, it is also personal. The second segment of the triad moves us from the collective body to the individual bearer. Its consonants are lamed, kaf, and yod, hierarchy, receptivity, and divine spark. Here lamed again lifts and guides, but now it does so toward a single recipient. Kaf remains the palm, the personal container. But yod, the point of divine condensation, now enters the triad. It marks a shift, from kingship as social function to kingship as interior transformation. This is the individual king, not merely a role, but a person authorized. Lamed raises him up, kaf receives on his behalf, and yod descends into him. He is not crowned by blood, nor by conquest, but by being chosen to carry the spark. He becomes a king only when the divine point is deposited within him. The pattern here is one of bestowed legitimacy. The man is exalted not by lineage, but by alignment with heavenly structure. The final movement of the triad brings us to the formation of kingdoms, not rulers, but the territories they shape. Here we encounter mem, kaf, and lamed, the sealed sea, the palm of governance, and the rod of instruction. This final mem is mem in closure, water no longer flowing but contained, stabilized, bounded. It speaks of territory, form, and completeness. Kaf here holds rule, and lamed administers it, the same instruments as before, but now not applied to persons, but to space. This is not just governance, it is structured realm. Kingdoms are not accidental units of geography. They are the political embodiment of the same logic that enthroned the king above. Containment of power, kaf, elevation through hierarchy, lamed, and the sealing off of chaotic motion into coherent form, mem. What had been rivers of kings now settle into bodies of rule. In this second triad, we see the world beneath the sovereign take shape. Authority cascades downward, from a collective field of rulers into individual persons bearing sanctioned power, and finally into the kingdoms they administer. The movement is not chaotic, it is patterned and derivative. Every king beneath the sovereign bears a reflection of his light. Every kingdom, no matter how distant, is a fractal of the first throne. This is not just hierarchy, it is architecture. The world is being ordered beneath the king, and every layer of it is shaped by the pattern above. If the first triad established the existence of sovereignty, this second triad describes its distribution. Rule descends into multiplicity, not by fragmentation, but by design. Through these nested rulers and realms, the one sovereign is not diminished, he is mirrored. Authority flows outward and downward, tiered, authorized, and complete. In the New International Version, Psalm 72 verse 11 continues, and all nations serve. With the king enthroned and the world of rulership structured beneath him, the verse now turns to a different horizon, not of kings, but of peoples. These are not sovereigns or governors, but nations, cultures, tribes, collectives that move across the earth in search of place and purpose. They do not yet serve. They do not yet see. But they move, and within them, something waits. With 9 characters in this phrase, the first segment begins with 3 letters: Gimel, Vav, and Yod, movement, connection, and hidden spark. Gimel is the traveler, the caravan, the act of going. It is not the journey of wandering, but of directed motion, the act of carrying something valuable toward its destination. Vav binds, but here it binds within. It holds the parts of a people together, preserving identity as they traverse uncertain ground. Yod, once more, is the divine point, the unseen presence embedded in form, a seed buried deep. Together, these letters form the nations in motion, not subjects, not worshippers, but bearers of unrealized potential. They are not aligned with the king, but neither are they resistant. They are simply unawakened. They move as peoples do, but carry within them a spark that has not yet reached the surface. They are vessels of latent recognition, drawn toward an encounter they have not yet experienced. That encounter arrives in the second segment: final mem, yod, and ayin, enclosure, spark, and perception. Final mem marks a sealed space, something hidden, something closed. It is the mystery not yet unveiled. Yod appears again, this time within the enclosure, waiting to be seen. And ayin, the eye, is not the act of glancing, but the act of truly seeing. It is perception that penetrates surface and reveals essence. This is the moment of witness. The nations do not yet serve, but they now see. What had been hidden within them, the spark of orientation, now emerges before them. They behold the king. They perceive the structure. They recognize that the dominion into which they are moving is not arbitrary, but true. It is the recognition of order, not as oppression, but as alignment with the grain of reality. This is the turning point. Perception before allegiance. Only after this awakening can the third segment unfold, the movement into service. Here the letters are Bet, Dalet, and Vav, the house, the doorway, and the joining bond. Bet is not simply a structure, it is the dwelling place, the sacred space of belonging. Dalet is the entryway, the threshold of transition. And Vav again binds, this time as the act of joining. These letters do not describe submission in the sense of defeat. They describe entrance into a shared structure, the house of the king. Service here is participation. It is the act of stepping through the door into covenantal union. The nations do not bow as captives. They enter as willing participants in a greater order. They are not annexed, they are joined. This third triad completes the movement from potential to fulfillment. First, the nations exist in motion, bearing hidden sparks. Then they see, perceiving the reality of the sovereign. Finally, they serve, not in subjugation, but in alignment. They do not merely respond to force. They recognize structure, they cross thresholds, and they bind themselves to it. The logic is sequential and ontological, from movement to recognition to participation. The world of peoples becomes the world of worshippers. The caravan becomes the congregation. The spark becomes flame. Through this progression, humanity awakens, and the king's dominion becomes complete not by conquest, but by coherence. The nations do not lose themselves. They find their place. And that place is within the house, sealed not by compulsion, but by vision and bond. The New International Version integrates the verse thus far as, "May all kings bow down to him and all nations serve." At this point, The structure of the verse has been constructed in full, not yet directed to its final object, but nevertheless operational. The architecture is set: sovereign, hierarchy, participation. Nothing more is added before the final clause, and so the system, as it stands, must be examined on its own terms. What we are shown is not merely the emergence of a ruler, but the consolidation of an entire regime. And without the anchoring reference to divine purpose, without the final to him, we are left with a model of rule that appears complete in its mechanics, but uncertain in its spirit. It becomes necessary, then, to ask what kind of order such a system might become when animated not by revelation, but by self-belief. It begins with the triad of king, throne, and dominion. This is the origin of the structure, a singular figure whose authority does not descend through recognized transmission, but rises from within the impression of convergence. His posture resembles divinity, his form suggests legitimacy, and so he acts. The throne that follows is not merely ceremonial. It serves as a metaphysical anchor, the constructed center that transforms enacted will into presumed authority. Dominion then unfolds from this center, not in the mode of violence, but as projection, law as extension, not instruction. One might expect such a king to rule gently, but his strength is not drawn from presence, it is drawn from coherence. He believes he rules in alignment with divine order, and it is that belief, rather than revelation, that empowers him to govern. In such a case, his rule would not manifest as overt tyranny. Instead, it would express as centralization, a self-reinforcing axis of command, emitting order that seems natural, inevitable, and complete. Resistance would not be punished for moral failure, but for disturbing the field of alignment. Obedience would be valorized not for its righteousness, but for its symmetry with the throne. From there, the second triad, all kings, individual kings, kingdoms, would begin to manifest. This is where the system scales. Authority that was once singular now multiplies, but only in form. Other rulers appear, but their value would be measured by their fidelity to the sovereign model. They are not chosen for their wisdom or tested by their discernment. They are selected, or tolerated, on the basis of resemblance. To diverge is to diminish the image. To reflect is to reinforce it. The authority they wield would thus be secondary not just in rank, but in nature. These kings serve not as governors with distinct mandates, but as transmitters of a singular pattern. Their kingdoms are not differentiated bodies of culture or conscience. They are administrative zones, territories arranged for the purpose of continuity. What appears as diversity in surface governance is, in effect, a consolidation of rule beneath the sovereign shape. Such a system would seem stable, because each layer confirms the next. But the apparent order would conceal a hollow core, multiplication without origin, alignment without evaluation, authority without internal correction. Finally, the third triad, nations, witness, service, would come into play. This is the point at which the structure engages the population. The nations, in such a system, would not be approached as partners or moral communities. They would appear instead as latent bodies, reservoirs of potential legitimacy waiting to be aligned. Their recognition, when it occurs, would not be cultivated through shared values or dialogue, but through spectacle, the visibility of the system itself, its majesty, its seamlessness. To witness, in this frame, would mean to perceive a coherent structure and mistake that coherence for justice. The nations would feel as though they are freely entering a bond, but in truth, the choices have already been narrowed. The service they offer would not be drawn from discernment, but from design. Participation becomes a kind of proof. Proof that the system works. Proof that the king is right. Proof that all has been ordered correctly. But the terms of this service would be subtly predetermined. There would be no room for refusal that does not appear as rebellion. To question would seem like chaos. To comply would appear as clarity. And over time, the line between participation and surveillance would blur. The people would feel seen, not in the sense of recognition, but in the sense of exposure. When these three strands converge, the self-authorizing sovereign, the network of derived rulers, and the population shaped into compliant subjects, the system reaches full coherence. It is not chaotic, it is not unstable, it functions exactly as designed. The king governs, the rulers replicate, the nations serve, and for that reason, it cannot be reformed from within. Its structure does not permit deviation. Its logic cannot accommodate interruption. Every layer confirms the one above it, and every function justifies the one before it. What results is not accidental totality. It is manufactured harmony, a system that consumes all alternatives, reconfiguring every gesture into compliance. The world appears ordered, but it is not ordered by truth. It is ordered by necessity. This is the turning point. The verse has constructed a total apparatus, a king whose authority is self-originating, a hierarchy of rulers beneath him, and a population brought into obedience through recognition. But the system, while complete, is not innocent. It requires maintenance. It demands agreement. And when agreement fails, it escalates. The sovereign, having built a structure that reflects his own perceived divinity, cannot allow its disruption. The rulers beneath him, authorized only by proximity to his pattern, must enforce that pattern or risk collapse. The peoples, drawn in through perception, must now be kept in through pressure. The system transitions from order to expectation, from participation to enforcement. What appeared voluntary becomes necessary. What felt luminous becomes compulsory. Alignment ceases to be revelation. It becomes demand. This is no longer a vision of holy rule. It is a map of absolute power, and absolute power must always be protected. Deviance becomes disloyalty. Resistance becomes betrayal. To question is to threaten the coherence that justifies the system's existence, so the system tightens. Rituals become surveillance. Doctrine becomes doctrine of loyalty. Dissent is treated not as disagreement, but as disorder, something that must be corrected or expelled. Not because the king is insecure, but because the system cannot accommodate rupture. It was not built for flexibility. It was built for totality. And so the machine becomes brutal. Not suddenly, not with obvious violence at first, but inevitably. Every layer begins to apply pressure to the one beneath it. The throne demands order. The kings impose it. The kingdoms legislate it. The peoples absorb it. When resistance emerges, as it always will, the system responds in the only way it can, by intensifying. It cannot slow down. It cannot reconsider. It was designed for coherence, and coherence now requires coercion. This is the nature of what the verse has built, a structure elegant enough to demand reverence, efficient enough to demand compliance, and closed enough to demand enforcement. It convinces before it compels. But when conviction fails, compulsion is waiting, and when that fails, only collapse or transformation remains. The tragedy here is not the system's corruption, it is its success. Everything has worked. The architecture holds, the kings obey, the nations serve. But nothing divine has entered. The throne is full, but not with presence. It is filled with the image of divinity mistaken for its substance, and in the absence of revelation, image becomes law, and law becomes command. This is the moment the verse has led us to. The system stands, but cannot save. It rules, but cannot redeem. It governs, but cannot love. The hierarchy does not fail by accident. It fails because it must be ruled by something it does not contain, and that something has not yet arrived. The completed verse now reveals the source of authority, in the New International Version as, "May all kings bow down to him, and all nations serve him." The text circles back to the sovereign, but not the one it previously constructed. This is not the self-authorizing king of dominion and hierarchy. This is a return, a reversal, a revelation. In Hebrew, the verse completes with two final consonants, he and vav. He is not a force but a breath, not a command, but a recognition. It is the consonant of unveiling, of revelation, not as assertion, but as clarity. Its arrival does not add another layer to the system. It exposes the meaning of the layers already in place. The people receive he not as external instruction, but as internal awakening. They see what the system has become, not by external critique, but through insight born of lived experience. It is not the structure itself that collapses. It is their blindness to its purpose that falls away. The system, having reached its apex of coherence, must now encounter something it did not generate and cannot contain. With this revelation, the architecture that once demanded obedience now demands judgment. And in that judgment, the truth becomes unmistakable. The system does not need to be destroyed. It needs to be redeemed. That redemption begins with vav, where he reveals, vav binds. It is the consonant of connection, the tether between insight and action, perception and participation. Revelation alone does not change the world. It must be joined to motion. Vav is that motion, the will to integrate what has been seen with how life must now be lived. It is not violent. It is not revolutionary. It is connective, healing, joining the heart's understanding to the body's movement. What enters is not another layer of rule, but a spirit that redefines the entire structure from within. The people, newly awakened, begin to connect their insight to the actual world. They no longer see the system as sacred, but as a vessel. And like all vessels, its value depends on what it contains. What emerges now is not revolt, but resolve. The people do not seek to tear down the structure. They see its shape, and through he and vav, they now understand its original purpose. The king, the hierarchy, the participation of the nations, none of these were inherently corrupt. They became distorted because they were filled with self-interest, with ambition masquerading as holiness. But structure in itself is not the enemy. It is a tool, and like all tools, it can either serve or enslave. This is the turning. The people do not cast off kingship, they reimagine it. The triad of king, throne, and dominion is not rejected. It is reinterpreted. A true sovereign, they now understand, is not the one who claims divine sanction, but the one who embodies divine character. The leader they need is not self-anointed, but self-emptying, a figure who does not assume command through the assertion of will, but through the embodiment of wisdom. The throne must be the anchor of service, not control. And dominion must radiate not through the projection of authority, but through the diffusion of justice. The rightful king is not one who rules by right, but one who governs by love, and whose authority is received, not imposed. In the second triad, all kings, individual kings, and kingdoms, a new logic takes shape. Where before there was replication of power, now there is distribution of responsibility. Other rulers will still exist, but they must arise not as reflections of a central image, but as stewards accountable to the people they serve. Leadership is no longer a chain of control, but a lattice of care. The crowns remain, but only as symbols of the trust placed in those who wear them. Kingdoms persist, but their purpose is transformed. No longer territories held in alignment to a central will, but communities shaped in response to human need. The system, once rigid, becomes organic. The pattern remains, but its function changes. And this is not anarchy. It is authority realigned with its rightful purpose. The third triad, nations, witness, and service, now blooms into its fullest form. The peoples are no longer subjects, they are co-participants. Their witness is no longer passive recognition, but active discernment. They do not serve out of expectation, but out of conviction. Service becomes sacred not because it is demanded, but because it is freely given. The bond between ruler and ruled is no longer predicated on force or tradition, but on mutual obligation rooted in shared vision. the nations enter the structure again, but this time on their own terms. Not to uphold an image, but to sustain a reality. Not to preserve an illusion, but to participate in truth. This is the prophecy embedded in the verse, not that the system collapses, nor that kings are cast down, but that the world, at last, comes to see what kind of person must rule. The system remains, and it must, for its architecture is not the problem. It is capable of coherence, of structure, of order scaled to the whole of humanity. But such a system, as we have seen, can either align the world with wisdom or harden it around control. It can extend peace, or it can enforce obedience. Its outcome depends entirely on who it serves. And when the people receive the final two signs, Her and Vav, revelation and bond, they no longer mistake function for fulfillment. They do not reject kingship, they recognize its purpose. They do not revolt against power, they discern who is fit to wield it. The kings of the earth are not removed, they are replaced, not by force but by recognition. Their rule ends not with uprising, but with irrelevance. The people now see through the image. They see the hollow center of the self-appointed sovereign and the machinery built to sustain him. And in its place, they demand something else. Not a new structure, but a new spirit. The throne is not recast. It is reinterpreted. It is emptied of ambition and made ready for presence. The true sovereign does not come with a sword. He comes with surrender. He does not conquer the system. He inhabits it, differently, rightly, in ways the system was never built to anticipate. He governs not from will, but from wisdom, not from self-interest, but from self-offering. And in so doing, he redefines authority. No longer does power validate the one who holds it. Now, it must be sanctified by the one who refuses to exploit it. Each of the foundational triads, once distorted, now finds its correction. The triad of king, throne, and dominion is no longer the pattern of imposed command, but the emergence of principled leadership. The king arises not through the presumption of divine alignment, but because the people recognize in him the fruits of it. He does not seize the throne, he is entrusted with it. And dominion, rather than radiating as unquestioned law, now unfolds as the extension of justice, wisdom, and care. A structure still firm, but flexible, alive, responsive to the needs of those it holds. The triad of all kings, individual kings and kingdoms, is likewise restored. Authority among many no longer mirrors a single absolute center, but becomes a network of responsibility, distributed, accountable, and bound by covenantal obligation. The rulers who remain do so not because they reinforce hierarchy, but because they have been entrusted to protect life within it. Kingdoms no longer represent zones of control. They become spaces of stewardship, tailored to their people, expressive of their character, coordinated rather than uniform. The system becomes polyphonic, structured still, but not singular in voice. And the triad of nations, witness, and service, once the machinery of alignment through pressure, now blossoms into its rightful form. The peoples no longer enter blindly or serve by expectation. They awaken, they see, and they choose. Witness is no longer surveillance, but true perception. They recognize the one who rules rightly, and their service becomes covenantal, not subjection, but offering. They bind themselves not to the system, but to the spirit that now inhabits it. Their obedience is not submission to power, but commitment to peace. This is the fulfillment of the verse, not when the system is fully formed, but when the world finally sees what kind of ruler is worthy of being followed. The one who does not claim the throne, but bears it in trust. The one who governs not from strength, but from humility. Who acts not from desire, but from discernment. Who rules not to possess, but to protect. That is the one the system was built to receive. That is the one the nations will follow, not by command, but by conviction. Psalm 72:11 ends not with domination, but with discernment. the kind that begins not in courts or councils, but in the conscience. When every eye sees what had been hidden, when every heart discerns what had been displaced, then the verse is fulfilled. The system remains, but no longer as instrument of control. It becomes the vessel of presence, filled at last, not with image, but with the reality it was always meant to reflect. It is not a call to submission, but a call to judgment that begins in the heart. When the world sees that this system, total, vertical, vast, was always waiting for a ruler who would never claim it for himself, then the verse is fulfilled. Not when every knee bows, but when every eye sees why they should.